Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Danielle Cooper, and I bring you greetings for today's event brought to us by One Standard of Justice in collaboration with Senator Gary Winfield. Before I pass it over to our great host, I just want to pause and let you all know I bring greetings from the University of New Haven, where I'm an associate professor of criminal justice. My focus is on areas of different types of offending and youth justice, injustice, equality. And I look forward to our discussion today. I value highly areas of restorative practices, storytelling, and lived experiences as a whole. And I know that our hosts feel similarly. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Cindy Prizio.
Thank you, Danielle. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I am Cindy Prizio, the Executive Director of One Standard of Justice, a volunteer-based civil rights advocacy organization in Connecticut. OSJ believes any sexual offense is one too many. We also believe, and this is supported by a huge body of evidence, that the laws and policies governing sexual harm do little to nothing to prevent future crime or keep our community safer. In fact, rather than reducing harm, harm is increased. Dr. Cooper and I were together in April 2019 when OSJ brought the first restorative justice conference into Connecticut called Healing Connections. We welcomed Drs. Alyssa Ackerman and Jill Levinson to lead the conference on vicarious restorative justice for people who have been sexually harmed, others who have harmed, and their families. We are committed to bringing RJ into the state through awareness and educational programs, such as this one this morning, and to implement a pilot program as an alternative to the criminal legal system in a district or municipality for all offenses, especially violent and sexual crime. This is the fourth webinar in a 5-part series. It's the second webinar on restorative justice. The first is entitled Practicing Restorative Justice for Sexual Harm, Trauma, Justice Needs, Participant Satisfaction, Equity, Law, and the Future, led by Dr. Mary Koss, a public health professional out of Arizona, and a team of experts. Mary led the Restore program out of Arizona for many years, which handled prosecutor-fed sexual crime cases, both misdemeanors and felonies, for resolution through a rigorous restorative justice process. Thank you to Senator Winfield, who has co-sponsored the webinar series and has lent his voice to a cause that often gets no attention unless punishment is being discussed. He can't be with us today as the Senate was called back for a special session. And thank you to Danielle Cooper, my friend and colleague whose voice enhanced the conversations immensely. In our final webinar of the series, OSJ is delighted to welcome back Dr. Carl Hansen, who will be joined by Senator Winfield 1 week from today as a welcome panelist conversing on the intersection of politics versus science. Is there common ground? My job is to set up the framework for today's RJ conversation. I want to start with a 3-minute video that is very relevant to the state of Connecticut right now.
We received a case about a stolen car, and we reached out to the young person, and he pretty quickly took responsibility for it. So we reached out to the victim, and the victim was extremely unhappy that the case had been diverted. And she'd brought a friend with her that day, and he said, I would really love for you to move forward. I'd really like to meet with this young man too. And so on the day of the conference, it was very powerful. Her friend leans in and he says, I know you because I used to be you. And he proceeds to tell the most powerful story about how he himself got caught up in stealing cars and it derailed his life and how he got his life back on track. And as if the rest of the room disappeared, and this young man and this man who turned his life around engage in a dialogue about how does one turn one's life around. So what makes you happy? What do you believe in, about yourself? Or what are you good at? And the kid puffs up and he says, I'm a really good artist. And his mother starts laughing. And she says, you can't pay this woman back $4,000 with your art. And just then the victim jumps in and she says, oh, yes, he can. Yes, he can, actually. If he paints me a Tinkerbell as tall as I am, I'll forgive all the debt. And we're all looking at each other like, a Tinkerbell? I'm sorry, did she say Tinkerbell? Some people might say, oh, that's soft on crime. He stole a car and he gets to paint something. But if that's what the victim wanted and that's what keeps him out of trouble for the rest of his life, then we should be really happy about Tinkerbell.
Stunningly, the video is called Tinkerbell. Did you see the teenager's face light up when he said he was a good artist? If only it could be that simple in Connecticut, and it can be. If RJ was introduced, we could have a lot of healing going on, and impacted youth may be stopped from continuing down the wrong path. And remember, RJ cannot happen without the victim choosing it. A word about Sujatha Baliga, who was the moderator in the film. She's a renowned RJ practitioner. Sujatha is a former victim advocate, a former public defender, and her work is characterized by her equal dedication to both people who have been sexually harmed and the people who have authored the harm. She herself is a survivor of child sexual abuse, her father being the person responsible. She was not given RJ as a choice back then. Her father passed away without them having the tough conversation, so healing and resolution were elusive for Sujatha and her family. Coincidentally, Sujatha is a facilitator in another RJ process that I'll be talking about next. The McBrides and their son Connor, and the Grossmears out of Florida. Connor McBride, in a fit of rage, shot his fiancée, Ann Grossmere, who had to be taken off life support a few days later. The Grossmears forgave him immediately. Connor was in prison, and Ann hadn't even passed yet when Mr. Grossmere was writing to him to say he was forgiven. Both families of faith searched for an RJ practitioner and found Sujatha. People often misconceive RJ as being soft on crime or excluding a prison sentence. Both are not true. The families did an RJ circle with Connor immediately before sentencing. The Grossmears asked the judge for a reduced sentence and for other conditions that were important to them. For example, they wanted Connor to be a role model, mentor, tutor within prison, and outside to be an inspirational speaker to other teens, suggesting the teens seek help for anger issues, among other issues that prevent them from living a healthy lifestyle or making good choices. The Grossmears made it crystal clear to Connor when he gets out of prison, he will be living for Ann as well as himself. And it was important to Ann's parents that he use his life to do good works. With that comes a lot of accountability. The judge gave Connor 20 years when he could have received the death penalty. So the question is, what do people who are victimized really want? Like the Grossmears, many want answers to their questions. Victims want to know why. Why were they picked? Why them? Does the author of the harm have real remorse? Does the author understand what was taken from them and their losses? Victims want an apology oftentimes, and to know the perpetrator is accepting the harm committed. The survivor victim often wants rehabilitation for the author of the harm. They want assurance that the behavior will not repeat itself, that no more people will be hurt. Some may want vengeance and retribution, or what we know as the carceral system. Those may be the receivers of the harm that are often the loudest. We must acknowledge whatever our beliefs are, that survivor victims are all different. In closing, let me talk about restorative justice on the rise. While it's also a great name for an educational organization founded by Marlee Rowan Leach, it is a true statement. RJ is happening more and more through progressive prosecutors, through programs in San Francisco, Philadelphia, Michigan, Brooklyn, New York, Washington, D.C., Colorado Springs, Colorado, New Mexico, and on and on. Sometimes it's for juveniles. Sometimes it's for both juveniles and adults. Sometimes it excludes sexual offense. Sometimes it includes all offenses. As I was guaranteed by an NACRJ member who is in judicial in Colorado, her department uses RJ for domestic violence cases. I'm plugging a few friends today and their organizations. NACRJ stands for the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice. A couple of years ago, pre-COVID, NACRJ held an international conference in Colorado in which 1,200 people attended, and we will be joining them in Chicago next summer. RJ is so very important to domestic violence and sexual offense cases, enabling families to be reunified instead of splintered apart, as is the case oftentimes for the rest of their lives. I believe RJ is helping to create healthy, whole people. There's the saying, hurt people hurt people. And while that shouldn't be an excuse, and I'm not suggesting it should be, we have to acknowledge the victim in everyone in order to heal and ultimately have safer, sustainable communities. I believe wholeheartedly change is possible. There's a James Baldwin quote I've been looking to use, and I think it's appropriate here. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Thank you to my friend and colleague, Marlee Liss, for sharing your story with all of us today and for your absolute belief system that there is a better way. Danielle?
Wow, Cindy, I just want to pause and take a second and acknowledge and thank you for your leadership, because not only in this moment today or throughout, as you mentioned, we're here in the fourth, part of this series, but in life and in the work that you're doing with One Standard of Justice, really both raising voices, raising issues, raising humanity, all of that is very important work. Before I move forward, I just want to pause because I think that the importance of the work calls me to invite you all to just take a breath, and in taking that breath, I just, I want to thank those of you who are here on this call, because perhaps you've been here in prior sessions, perhaps you've really been taking in these pieces. And I really, part of what I digested in the video that was shown by Cindy is the opportunity to really ask ourselves what we believe in, center our values. And I really think that's part of what restorative justice continues to amplify and bring to me. I mentioned my role at the University of New Haven, but more specifically, I serve as the Director of Research at the Tal Youth Justice Institute. And the values that helps me center are sharing and learning, but also discourse and translation and, that difficult layer of understanding that requires agitation, that requires you to ask yourself what you think very passionately, because Cindy really brought out and highlighted, like, this is an emotional discussion. It impacts people profoundly. But as a researcher, my task in this conversation is hopefully to continue to remind people that the knowledge here brings us to a place of wanting, right? Wanting to know that we don't have to create harm in certain policies in certain ways, and that we can have the public safety, the shared reimagined value system that we're discussing. And so I will now take a moment and just I'm going to just give a little bit of your bio, Marlee, and then allow you to introduce yourself. Marlee is an international coach for women and restorative justice advocate. She is also a retreat facilitator, and through her coaching work, she has empowered hundreds of women to reclaim their sexuality and self-love with her clients, healing trauma, body shame, disordering eating, dissociation, and more. Marlee's work has been featured on a major public platforms. And so we are beyond lucky to have you here with us today, Marlee. I'll pause there because I don't want to eat up any more of your time for you to talk with us. I just want to remind the audience that A, you're being recorded, and B, we welcome your questions and answers in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those after Marlee shares her incredible narrative with us. Thank you and welcome, Marlee.
Thank you so much, Dr. Danielle and Cindy, for the beautiful introductions, and thank you everyone for being here today. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Amazing. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here, and I really appreciate the introduction. And it's true, like it is an emotional conversation as much as it's a practical one. So I'm going to dive into this and just share a little more about who I am. So like Dr. Danielle was saying, I'm a coach for women. I work with women all over the world who are reclaiming sexuality, especially after trauma and shame. And the story that I'll share with you today is that my sexual assault case was the first in North America to conclude with restorative justice through the courts, as far as I'm aware. And my work has been featured through Forbes, BuzzFeed, Mel Robbins' show, HuffPost, and more. I just want to find a way to see the chat. Here we go. Okay, there we go. So this is really what I've dedicated my life to, and I do a lot of advocacy work around restorative justice and sharing this story because I really do feel that it's so important that we explore alternatives to punitive justice for survivors and for all of us, really. So I'd love to just take a moment and know who you are. I really always appreciate an interactive space. So if people could just write in the chat your name and where you're tuning in from, that would be awesome and great for me. So just take a moment to do that. And then, of course, welcome Cheryl, welcome Kathleen. Beautiful, welcome Kathy and John. Yeah, it's nice to connect with the humans we're speaking to. David, Mike, welcome. Thank you for being here, everyone. And of course, this group's a little different. I'll typically ask this question, how many people are familiar with restorative justice? And I'm sure that people here are much more familiar with it than the general public. And at the same time, I imagine it's something that might be quite new to us, unless it's something that we grew up with in our communities. It's so under talked about. And this is something I really hope to shift, is just the awareness around restorative justice. And then how many people have heard of restorative justice being used for sexual violence? And almost always when I ask this question, nobody has heard of it being used for sexual violence. And again, of course, this group is a little bit different in that way, but I think it's important for us to realize that most people have never heard of or considered this. And I certainly had not heard of or considered this, even after going through the system for years and years. So thank you all for saying hello. I'm so grateful that you're here and that you're open to this conversation. So I'm going to share with you today my own story and how I really strive to bridge justice with healing. And just to share some context that I've shared this story in, it's been a wild ride for sure. I experienced restorative justice myself, and then after that shared in the media, and since then have done tons of speaking and interviews. I've done consulting for the US military sexual assault response team. I was on a panel for the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence in Canada. I was on some self-help talk shows, spoke to the police services and many, many government officials like many of you here. And of course, through my work with women, I share a lot with survivors and connecting with the survivor community every single day with people all over the world. So I just want to share a bit of a trigger warning. I'm not going to go into any graphic details about what I went through, but of course, as there already has been, there's going to be mention of sexual violence. So I'm always very passionate about taking a trauma-informed approach when speaking about trauma. So I just want to say, take care of yourself, drink water, breathe. Like maybe some of these beliefs in my own story might bring up some emotions for you or some resistance, and that's okay. I definitely know that my story is a very controversial one. So just be be gentle with yourself in that way. And I will dive into my story. So in 2016, I experienced rape from a stranger. And this really, really changed my life, obviously, and sent me into a very, very deep depression. I was considering taking my life at one point. I was experiencing PTSD. It really shook my world in so many ways. And I remember there was this moment right after I experienced this where my friend and I we didn't know what to do. And we literally Googled, what do you do after sexual violence? And Google said, go to the hospital, do a rape kit, and then report. And so I was really just going through the motions, and I went and I did the rape kit. And then that moment came where they said, well, would you like to report or not? And this is a moment that I'm so passionate about us shifting, because there's no third option given. And I'm personally from Ontario, Canada, and it's actually in the Victims' Bill of Rights that we are meant to be informed about restorative justice, but no one ever is. And so this is what I've realized is it really comes down to personal beliefs and biases and the emotional charge that might come with what does it mean to offer a victim restorative justice, and are people comfortable doing that? And I really resonate with the video that Cindy shared. And for me, if I had known about restorative justice right away, I really would have chosen that path, but I didn't know about it. And so I did choose to report. I didn't want nothing. So I chose to report, and I started walking the punitive path for 3 years. I did a preliminary trial to see if there was enough evidence, and there was, and that was really hard. I'll share more about that. But something I do want to say is at this time, my focus was really on my own healing, right? I was really in a place of, I don't know if I'm going to be okay. And I was focused on therapy, on all these things, and very much myself. And it was very hard to focus on the punitive system at that time. But what I really, really wanted, and I said this to friends deep down, and like I said, I didn't know restorative justice existed, but I said to very close friends, if this was my world, I would sit down with this person. I would ask them why this happened. So many of the points Cindy touched on, I was like, that's exactly why I fought for this. I wanted to hear an apology. I wanted to ask my questions. I wanted to humanize this person so that they didn't have to be like a big, scary, mysterious entity to me. I needed to just like hear them speak, bring it into that humanness a bit. So there's so much around this, and I'll share more about that. But so I did start going through the punitive system, like I said, and 2 years after I reported, that was when I went to preliminary trial. And I will definitely share that I actually almost want to say it felt re-traumatizing, re-victimizing, and also borderline abusive. And I really felt like I was just this kind of pawn in the system, and the goal was to address the perpetrator, to address his punishment. And I was just like a thing to be used in that goal. And sitting on the stand, I was up there for about 5 hours, and I remember he was just looking down at the floor, and I was being asked the most invasive questions. No one ever asked me, you know, what do I want? What would make me feel more safe? What would bring closure? Am I okay? How am I feeling? Like there was never this element of care or focus on myself as the survivor. And I think that is such a problematic approach that we're taking, and one that causes a lot of further harm. So after the trial, I remember being really proud of myself for having been able to share, because I really thought that I would just lose my voice completely and like go blank and have this dissociation experience, but I did do it. But other than that, I really felt like nothing productive was happening. At the same time, I was studying social work. I was working with an Indigenous elder in a lot of my own healing. I was working in a lot of different like feminist spaces as well. And the more I was focused on that and my own healing, the more I was questioning, is this actually productive? Is anything actually going to change from all this? So the the preliminary trial happened. And then basically about a year after that is when I was subpoenaed for the criminal trial. And at this point, I was really seriously considering dropping the charges because of all the reasons I was just sharing. I did not want to go back on the stand for my own mental health, primarily. And I just didn't see what the point was, right? There's so many statistics that show us that almost all the time perpetrators get acquitted. And even when they're incarcerated, what happens then? They go and they sit in a cell and they sit in their shame and isolation, and maybe they're exposed to more violence. And all of those factors are like the number one drivers of causing violence. So for me, I was just like, where does this end? Where does that cycle that Cindy was speaking about of hurt people, like where does that actually end? Because the way I see it in the system, it just continues and continues. So once I was subpoenaed, I was really considering dropping the charges. And I had a lot of grief around that. I had a really big process around that because it's not what I actually wanted. And I remembered at that time that I told a friend, a really close friend, that vision I'd shared earlier of, if it was my world, this is what we would do. This is how we would handle this. And she said to me, so make it happen. And I had never considered validating the needs that I had as a survivor until she said that. So once she said that, I started researching and everything. And that's when I came across restorative justice. I was like, wow, there's actually a name for this thing that I've been wanting for so long. And I really reflect on that a lot. I'm like, why did it take me so long to discover this option, to discover this alternative to the punitive system? Especially when I had shared that vision with therapists and legal professionals and nothing ever was mentioned to me. So this is a big part of why I share my story, is I really want survivors to at least know what our options are so that we can make a decision from a place of clarity, of having those options, because I really do think that all with the punitive system or nothing is a very limited binary to choose from. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with restorative justice at this point, but I'll just share that on a very simple definition level. This is basically a system that focuses on repair rather than punishment. And it's rooted in Indigenous, Jewish, and Mennonite cultures. It believes in transformation, essentially. And it's not actually anti-incarceration, but it places incarceration as a last resort. It's like, let's try all these interventions first and then see what happens from there. So once I learned about this, I eventually got connected with a lawyer who is a major advocate for restorative justice. And we met up and we said, well, let's go and meet with the prosecutors. And there were 2 Crown attorneys assigned to my case. Well, there was actually one, but they were in the process of handing it off. So they were both in the room when we had this meeting, which was very important to my story and to this outcome. And I came in and I said, I don't want to go to criminal trial. And right away, one of the prosecutors launched into a speech about like, oh, why don't you think you're powerful enough for a criminal trial? You seem like a strong girl. I think you can do the trial. We'll do the trial. And I was like, whoa, that's not why I came in here. And so the lawyer helped me to say, well, Marlee, we came in with a reason and a vision. So can you share more about what that is? And this is when I asked for restorative justice. And this is where I think it's very, very important that we look at the reaction to survivors sharing what we want, because of course we know like trauma and sexual trauma is such an experience of powerlessness, of our voices being discounted completely. And so for me to go through a 3-year process after that, where I feel powerless and my voice is discounted completely, that was really hard. And this was kind of the moment where I felt I was taking my power back and saying, well, this is what I want. And this does matter. And so I asked for this, and the prosecutor that had been quick to steer us back to criminal trial, she shared, well, Marlee, with the Me Too movement, people want to see rapists locked up for longer amounts of time. And I think that that statement, the irony in that statement, is exactly what we are kind of questioning today, is we can't use something like the Me Too movement to justify silencing survivors' voices and acting on our behalfs without our consent. Right? There's so much irony in that. So that's kind of what I shared in response. And she said, well, don't you understand that rape is bad? And I shared, yeah, of course, because I experienced it. And I believe it's so bad that we have to try something different because what we're doing is not working. So at this point, we kind of left the meeting there. Oh, and this is important, the other prosecutor, whose name is Kara Sweeney, and she is incredible, and we've worked together a lot since this. She shared in that meeting, she kind of spoke up and said, you know, I agree with Marlee in this because I've been a Crown attorney for 20 years and I see victims re-traumatized on the stand every time, and I see perpetrators acquitted, and I see charges dropped because the process is too painful, and I see offenders re-offending. And it is time that we try something different. So we had these two like really opposing perspectives, and we kind of left the room at this point. And my lawyer said, it's out of our hands now, let's see what happens. And they sort of fought for the case for a while, these two prosecutors. And that was a really interesting time for me, where I just kept focusing on my own healing and my own needs as a survivor. And this is really what this whole journey asked me to do, is to say, my needs as a survivor matter. They matter enough for me to ask for them, to advocate for them, to tell the prosecutor that this is what I want, even though it's not how the system typically handles it. And so that took a lot of my own reclamation of power. So I kept focusing on that. And of course, this is really like what I help survivors and women reclaim today, is your wants do matter, even though no one's asked you about them. They should matter the most. They should be at the center of this conversation. So about a month and a half after that meeting, I did get a call from my lawyer, and he said, we got the restorative justice outcome. This is going to happen. Your assailant's going to start therapy right away, and eventually you'll meet in a restorative circle. And I want to acknowledge that the process won't work for everyone, right? The assailant to some degree has to be willing and open and available to go into that restorative path. But it will work for way more cases than we think, way more than we think. And I really want to emphasize the level of healing that I felt through getting that call alone. Because when I got that call, it was like, wow, for the first time since this trauma, you know, this trauma where my mouth was covered and my no was not heard, for the first time since that, people are actually listening to what I want, and they're actually caring about what my needs are in order to heal and to be okay. And that was in and of itself so deeply healing. So from the moment we started along the restorative justice path, because it was kind of like we're going down the punitive, and then we fully rerouted into restorative. And from that moment, it was very much like day and night. So every sort of non-consensual and disempowering experience I had with the punitive system, it was totally different in restorative justice. There was actually this element of care and of dehumanizing, acknowledging that I'm not just a witness to a crime done to the state or the Crown, but I'm a human who experienced harm. And even this language that restorative justice uses of the person who experienced harm and the person who caused harm, I think that alone is a very incredible shift. And this is really, to me, about, like we were saying, breaking chains of hurt people, and acknowledging that crimes happen in context as well. I don't believe that there are just bad seeds born into our world. I believe that people are born and then they're immersed in a rape culture, and they experience trauma and conditioning around patriarchal behavior and degradation, and these things are deeply taught until the point where someone can justify this level of violence, and that's never an excuse for violence. But it is an opportunity for us to say, oh, there's a reason this is happening. There's a deeper root than just this one bad seed. And that's what we need to address. So for me, for my assailant to be going to therapy and unpacking all of that learning and whatever trauma led him to that point, something I actually got to ask him in the circle was, what happened between the time a baby was born and a perpetrator was made? I think this is a question that we need to ask more often. So that's just a reflection I'll invite you to sit with, is if all of these things can be taught, do you think that they can also be unlearned? And you're welcome to write in the chat like any thoughts that might come up with for you around that. So something really beautiful is that restorative justice takes a community-oriented approach. So this is a picture of me and my mom actually got to sit in this circle with me, as did my sister. And they weren't just there as support people, they were there as people who had also been affected by this trauma. And that's something that's really under talked about as well, is this trauma changed my mom's life. She also needed to go through a process of closure and healing. So I really appreciate that aspect of restorative justice. And so after about 7 months of my assailant going through extensive therapy, we did meet in a circle. We met face to face, and the circle lasted 8 hours. And when I say that, a lot of people are like, that sounds horrible. But for me, I needed it to be 8 hours because there was so much unpacking and closure and healing that needed to be addressed. And there were 2 mediators there. There was my mom, my sister, myself, the lawyer I'd been working with, Kara Sweeney, the amazing prosecutor I'd mentioned earlier, my assailant, and his friend. And they asked us just this one question of, what brought you here today? And we took 8 hours answering that. And again, I'll share that the whole process was rooted in care. And I will never minimize that this was really hard. I will never minimize that and say restorative justice is all rainbows and sunshine, the punitive system is horrible, because at the end of the day, we're still talking about how to address sexual violence. And really, in an ideal world, we don't need to have that conversation. So that's important to note as well. But all of those needs I've mentioned earlier, for accountability, for remorse, for forgiveness, for understanding why this happened, all of these needs were met to such an incredible degree. Like, I really like to say that the way this circle went was beyond my expectations, but aligned with my dreams. And maybe that sounds cheesy, but it was very real for me. Because my biggest fear was that he would kind of just go through the motions, right? This soft on crime narrative, he'd kind of just go through the motions so he could get a check mark and move on with his life. But that's not what happened. And he did show up with deep remorse, with a deep presence. He had tears in his eyes. Many times he did look me in the eyes and say, I did sexually assault you. I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do to take that back. And I hope being here today can help. And maybe some people hear that and they say, well, that's not enough. That's just words. But for me, and this is what I think we need to care more about, is like, look at the survivor, what's happening for them. And for me, that moment, it was like a knot untied in my body. And I just started crying. And it was like a really deep relief that I didn't even know I needed. And he did show a lot of very grounded shifts in terms of using consensual language, sharing about what he'd learned in therapy, talking about how he'd realized that so much of his conditioning, the media he's exposed to, his friend group, all these things, like did lead him to degrade women in such a way. And so seeing that level of transformation was so incredibly powerful. And who knows what's going on with this, if this will actually happen. But he did share at one point that, you know, he wants to help stop sexual violence. And that was such a big moment for me. And it made me ask this question: is, if trauma can be the catalyst that changes so many survivors' lives, then can it potentially be a catalyst for perpetrators to change their lives as well? because we see this all the time, right? So many survivors becoming activists or advocates like I've done, like so many of us have done. And I do think there's a potential where a perpetrator shocks themselves or crosses their own boundaries or values so much, or feels such deep shame or remorse or guilt that it changes their life as well. And I have heard incredible stories like that as well. So emphasizing this as well, when I left that room, I felt deeply, deeply joyful. I was really in awe of my own strength. I was really in awe of all of us for being able to take something so horrible and then to sit down and actually find closure. Like that really amazed me. And it's just such a contrast to how I left the courtroom that day and how we almost always see survivors leaving the courtroom. So since then, I have shared my story with the media. I've empowered myself to be very loud about this because I do think it's so important. I felt a major sense of closure and reclamation of voice. And after sharing with Forbes, HuffPost, BuzzFeed, all these platforms, I started receiving hundreds, thousands of emails from survivors and people impacted by sexual assault all over the world. And this is kind of when I committed to saying, I'm going to dedicate my life to this. I'm going to be an advocate, a speaker. I'm going to be a coach, working with women and healing sexual shame, trauma, and going on to do all this work. And this is just a picture of, I'm just going to acknowledge that I'm going a little bit over time. And so Cindy, I'm happy to go about 10 minutes over if we need to. But this is a picture from the circle where the mediators actually told us to write down 2 values that we had. And I wrote down love and my assailant wrote down courage. And I actually asked to take these papers home at the end of the day. And I still have them. And it's almost like the most tangible thing I have that represents this whole journey from the rape up to the circle. So that's pretty wild. And just sharing a bit more about what I do now. So the coaching, the advocacy, the speaking, I'm working on my memoir right now. And I'm also on contract for my story to be made into a documentary and a scripted series, which I'm excited about because like I'm sharing, I do think that this story and these stories and this lens of what do survivors actually want is so important. So every day I get to work with survivors and women who are overcoming shame and trauma. These are just some reflections from the women that I've worked with. And I really do want to emphasize that when I first shared this, I was very nervous that survivors would almost be mad at me. They'd be like, why would you fight for this approach? Who would want this other than you? And I had some of those deep-rooted beliefs. And then I started receiving those emails, hearing from hundreds, thousands of survivors who said, I wish I could have had this. I asked for this and I didn't get it. I wish someone asked me what I wanted. I wish I could sit in a circle like this and feel safe again in my body and in our world. So this really blew my mind. I was like, wow, like survivors want this. Not all survivors want this, but at the end of the day, we do all want to be heard, to feel seen, cared for, to be treated with respect in our pathway to justice, to be asked what we do want. And like Cindy was sharing at the beginning, almost all of us want to make lasting change. First and foremost, we want to make sure that our assailant doesn't do this again, or that this doesn't happen to another woman, another person. So it's about breaking those cycles of hurt people, and seeing if we can ignite cycles of something much more healing. So that is basically it. These are just some ways that you can connect with me. You can follow me on Instagram, or you can look at my website for my speaking or coaching work, anything like that. And we'll come into our Q&A now. I just want to say thank you so much for listening with an open mind. And I know, again, this can be an emotional conversation. So I really appreciate you all. And in terms of Q&A, I've been asked everything in response to my story. So don't be shy to share your questions.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and just do some acknowledgments from some other things that happened in the chat. You asked people who they were and their knowledge of restorative justice. Many people reached out to us in our, little panelist area. Also, people spoke, some of them, about their experiences with restorative justice and where they first learned about it from. To me, that's a fascinating conversation that could be had in and of itself, but more importantly, I think your story, the fact that you could describe something and be in place where people could and should serve you, raise a few thoughts and questions for me. But before I get to my own question, in our actual Q&A, one of the comments basically said, thank you for sharing your experience with all of us. You're an inspiration. You mentioned humanizing your rapist, and I think that is key, not only for victims healing, but for communities. Without this restoration for all victims, we have all this unaddressed hurt and fear living in our communities. Can you discuss how this helps repair and transform communities? Pass that to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for all your shares in the chat. I really, really appreciate it. And I think that that's a conversation that doesn't get had very often. Of course, I had a huge need for my assailant to humanize me. But I also did have that need to humanize him. And part of that was on a very trauma healing level. I was having nightmares about him. I was having flashbacks, and he was like this big, scary entity to me. And when I sat down and I was able to ask those questions of, why did this actually happen? Like, who are you and why did this actually happen? It allowed me to put some of it in perspective and to say, oh, this is just a human. Like, this is just a human who is being deeply led by trauma conditioning. Again, not an excuse at all, but it allowed me to feel more safe just from having that understanding. We actually got to a point where we at the end of the circle, he said, this meant so much. He said, with permission and respect, would you be open to shaking hands as a gesture of respect? And that was so huge to me, to just hear that consensual language, first of all, and then we did shake hands, and that felt like such a tangible representation of that repair, of now we can coexist in this world, and that's okay. And so it's so different from that lifelong punishment or avoidance that really does rip so many communities apart.
Well, you just raised so many fascinating points. The piece about humanity brings us to this person first, this just acknowledgement of oftentimes what, for lack of a better word, is a shared experience, even if it's a traumatic experience, even if it's an experience in which one person has caused harm and another person has created harm. And, one of the things that you kind of rounded out with at the end is this kind of thought. I thought it was a very provocative question of if this, we know for a fact that these traumatic events inform and impact, in many ways greatly, the people who experience the harm. Why wouldn't we think that the knowledge of that would also be profound and impactful to others? I'm going to go to another question that came up in the Q&A. Many thanks again for sharing your story, which is hopeful and has powerful insight. And you mentioned Monica Lewinsky as powerful voices in this regard. Is there a name for this movement in contrast to #MeToo?
Interesting. Yeah. There's not necessarily a name for this yet. I have had some journalists frame it as what's next after the Me Too movement, right? It's the what's next. And actually that's an interesting thing too, because hope is such an important thing, as I'm sure we all know and feel. And there was this feeling after the Me Too movement of devastation and what do we do with all this? And I think that the conversation did kind of stop there in many spaces, not all spaces. But there does need to be this conversation of, okay, so there's all this harm, and what do we actually do with this? What actually happens next? And I do think restorative justice is an essential part of that conversation.
Another question we have is, can you clarify a little bit more about the contact you had with the individual who harmed you prior to the 8-hour meeting? And so can you also, like, from a logistic perspective, there's a prosecutor who paid for that. Is that happening within their budget, life budget, your budget? And what penalty did the, individual, what did they, what was the sanction disposition, if any, occurred?
So something that I'll always be very real about is that something my lawyer said was, we're really making this path as we walk it, because the system hasn't designed this. This hasn't been done for sexual violence, for adult crimes of this degree. And so there were a few things that I'm like, we could have done this differently in terms of like follow-up, especially. But yeah, I had only met my assailant during the assault, that one time in preliminary trial, and then at the circle. I had no contact with him outside of that. And I know that he went through that therapy for 7 months, and I'm not sure. I think that it was paid out of his budget. But to be so honest, there are a lot of details that my lawyer worked out that I had no idea what was going on. But I do think that that's an important point, actually, is that I knew all about what I wanted to know about, and I didn't know about what I didn't want to know about. And to me, that's such a reflection of a survivor-centered process of, hey, what do you want to know about? Versus being bombarded with so much information that can be triggering. So I'll just be real about that. And then they looked to me at the end of the circle, and again, looked to me and said, are you satisfied? Do you want us to drop the charges, or do you want this to go back to the punitive route, back to criminal trial? And I was like, I'm so deeply total with my decision to drop the charges. So there was no sentence with that. And that, of course, is a very controversial point. And for me, I'm so total with that decision.
Quick follow-up. Do you know, or did you hear in the circle why the individual who caused harm, did they speak to why they wanted to come? What was the, particular value for them in participating?
Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, I think that when he shared about this, when he started the therapy process, there were levels of denial. There was like an avoidance of his feelings, his remorse, his shame. And he shared about a moment when that really shifted for him, and he like almost was flooded with like, wow, I have to face what I did. I have to take accountability on an emotional level. And he did show up to that circle with deep respect. And I think that was essential in his own healing. An amazing quote I heard in a book that I'll recommend to everyone if you haven't read it. It's called Until We Reckon. And it's by Danielle Sarid, who owns a restorative justice organization. And she says, the same way that survivors need healing, equal to that, perpetrators need accountability. And I think that that's very real, that in order for him to actually transform and contribute to the world around him in a safe and kind way, I think that he needed to have that moment of accountability. So as much as the circle was for me, I also feel it was for him in that way. Yeah.
Wow. Our next question speaks to the fact that restorative justice has this proven track record of, helping people with and getting to positive outcomes. But we also hear the voice of victims advocates saying that victims never recover. Never recover from the trauma that they live for the rest of their lives. Is there a path to working with victims advocates who have this perspective? I just want to add and pause, to me, part of what, this question also addresses, you spoke to this knowledge point of getting services, being in communication about what might have helped you. Can you also comment as to whether or not victims advocates in Canada, like, is that a thing, or did you experience a person who who had that same type of like service offering that we're speaking about here from the United States?
Interesting. Not too much. I think there's a big lack of support for survivors in Canada. I was able to seek out an advocate on my own that kind of like attended the preliminary trial with me and helped explain to me what was going on, because I really was totally in the dark about the whole punitive process. But I have heard that perspective, and I do think that it's a very like disheartening perspective to just kind of accept that, well, you know, this person experienced trauma, they're going to be like damaged for the rest of their lives. And this is another reason that I share a lot about this, and I do the work that I do with women like directly, is because I don't subscribe to that narrative. Like, my life is way too precious for me to feel damaged for the rest of my life. And so, while I do believe there are lifelong impacts of trauma, with any like same with anything, like grief, loss, any of these big life events, like they impact us to a certain degree. But I definitely don't think that survivors are just damaged. I feel more empowered than I did before the assaults happened. And so I think that's really important representation in the survivor community to have. And it also informs the way we address justice. Because if we're just complacent, if we're maybe not complacent, but if we're just like, I guess this is the way it is, like these people are damaged and we got to punish these people over here, rather than being kind of like visionaries and saying, well, what world do I actually want to live in? And how can I contribute to creating that world?
You know, I just want to add, because in your presentation, you also raised the point that I think, you know, is relevant of, are individuals who have been harmed interested in this process? Because that's multi-layered, right? You're raising the point of, do they know about it? But sometimes the discussion when we're at the table discussing the value of restorative justice is just, do they want it? Do they want to spend time doing it? Is it, you know, another way to re-traumatize people? There's so much, like, anything can you comment to what might be sometimes the misinformation about, you know, the array of what are restorative practices and the value that they have? You kind of mentioned at the end in your testimonials that you've heard people say yes. Are you hearing a mixed amount of things, or can you kind of speak about that knowledge versus not wanting the effort? Like, where are we, or where are we not understanding?
Yeah, I actually made a post about this online the other day, and I just wrote, why would any survivor of sexual violence want restorative justice? And I just went through all these myths that exist around that. And like I've said, I've received thousands at this point of emails, of messages from survivors saying, I wish I had this. And that's like an emotionally loaded message for people. They're not just like, oh, this sounds cool. They're like, I needed this, is actually what so many people are saying. And when we actually get into the practical conversation of why people might want this, it makes a lot of sense. For most people, sexual violence, I think 80% of the time is someone that we do know. For me, it was a stranger, but 80% of the time it's someone that we do know. So survivors are asked, do I want to take the punitive path and try to send this person to prison, who might be their father, their best friend, their teacher, whatever? Or do I want nothing at all? And this is why so few people report, because it doesn't feel safe for us. We're like, do I want to rip my family apart? Do I want to, sit on the stand and be faced with all these invasive questions? Do I want to like fight to send this person to prison? And a lot of the time that just causes us more harm. And it causes our whole community more harm. Like, families are ripped apart under that narrative. And so one of the most common messages I receive are from survivors of incest, who are saying like, this happened in my family and I stayed quiet about it, and the abuse continued for 10 years because I didn't want to fight for my dad to go to prison. And so if those are our only options, then that's leaving a lot of people in situations of silence and further abuse.
I just want to say, because part of what I hear, I love this translation opportunity, is like when we are only offered criminal justice, we continue in the face of other opportunities to think, well, what if I have to do it in the criminal justice way? Well, what if I have to, right? Criminal justice focuses on how does the person who has done harm get what they quote unquote deserve. And that is what is the name of justice. And when we can just pause and understand that restorative practices, restorative justice is, how do we center the victim? And if we're centering the victim and we're making the victim feel safe and we're working on making the victim feel whole, then your point is that that's the trajectory to also what is going to make the person who caused the harm more whole, is also like beyond beyond needed, and it shouldn't be mind-blowing. The pieces that are restorative practice are as simple, and as deep and historical, but they're not a part of the dominant narrative of our justice offerings. And we have discussions like this to really bring us closer to a shared understanding of what is the meaning of restorative justice, or more broadly, the continuum of a practice. Like, I wrote down to myself 3 quick notes. Like, what is it that I now know that I didn't really know about restorative practices 2 years ago? I would say 1 is this narrative of being victim-centered, and just really building from there gives a lot of space, regardless of, what is the type of offense. I think we've seen that. I think this piece about it being a continuum, and not just being one thing. It's sometimes what we do with kids in circles or adults in circles. It's also when violent offenses have happened. We see a structure and a space to create proper discussion and accountability, because that's what people are asking for. How do I get to speak to you about what you did to me, or speak about what was done to me, and bring it to a close in a way that isn't the goal of the justice system when we speak of criminal justice. And that just brings me to the last point of, doesn't fit in a box. What we often think it is, or even sometimes when we say, oh, I see it over there, it shows up in a lot of different ways. And we just have to continue to challenge ourselves forward in this discussion of restorative justice. And so I thank you, Marlee. As you have seen in the chat, at Marlee Liss, please know that Marlee is greatly contributing to this discussion. Thank you. Thank you for this transparency, and just this authenticity and this opportunity for you to share, because I think you really addressed a wide range of questions that are at the underbelly of discussions. People ask, is it for me? People ask, does it work? People ask, do victims want it? People ask, is it letting people off? I don't know that 8 hours with you in a room is an easy thing when you've been hurt and you've been waiting on that moment, and you're saying, no prosecutor has anything on me really wanting to get and hear from you what has happened so that I can leave here. I need to leave here for me, is what I really heard from you. So just any last words from you, Marlee, before I close this out?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Danielle, Cindy, everyone who's here, and everyone who's been writing in the chat. I'll definitely say, like, just, yeah, that reflection of, if we've all spent years and years thinking solely about how to suitably punish perpetrators, and we haven't given any care or attention to, what about survivors? What does the survivor want? Is the survivor okay? That's what I think all of us can shift on a human level, and then on a judicial level, that's just like a result of that humanity shift. But yeah, please do that and share our stories. I've shared this everywhere. If you Google my name, you'll see this everywhere. And if this is a narrative that you want to help unpack as well, if you want to help advocate for restorative justice, I really do invite you to share my story, to reach out, to book me for speaking. I'm very much available to contribute to this movement in many ways. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of that today. So yeah, I really appreciate it. And feel free to reach out as well if you have personal questions or thoughts or anything.
Thank you again, Marlee. Remember, Marlee's reachable at Marlee Liss, and I'm reachable at Prevention Danny everywhere. I want to thank One Standard of Justice and remind you all that we'll have a final event in this series where we discuss with Senator Gary Winfield and Carl Hansen, overlapping thoughts of what we've been discussing all throughout what has been this 2021. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.